including Eileen, for joining us. Thank you. I can hear myself coming through some speakers, so can everybody hear me? Okay, great. We're here this evening. We're doing a couple of things at the same time. One, we wanted to release and kind of do a bit of a conversation around a couple of reports that Jim Miller and I and the team have been working on here on a project we call Project Pathways. And this is looking at the various ways that there can be pathways to crisis or conflict between the United States and Russia and what we do about it. And this project, which CNAS has done in cooperation with the Belfer Center at Harvard, has been something that's been going on for a couple of years now. We've put out this report, among others, which are available out there. We had planned to have our latest report, which is the What Do You Do About It, to come out for today, but it is in the sort of maze that is DoD pre-publication security review. And so as soon as that is done, we will be able to give that out to you. But we can have some conversation tonight about some of the what do you do about some of these things. Just very briefly before we get into this conversation, I just wanted to point out a couple of these three pathways that we talk about here. One is how do you actually get into crisis or conflict between the United States and Russia. One, obviously, is a deterioration of U.S. Russia relations. I think that's probably the most obvious one. But there are two others, too, that we looked at. One is rapid escalation due to increasing incentives to use non-kinetic capabilities. Cyber means anti-satellite capabilities, and to use those early in a crisis or conflict. And then third is pressure on strategic stability, the potential for new military capabilities, including cyber and counter space capabilities, to undermine strategic stability. And we'll talk about some of these things tonight. But our overall contention is that we, the United States, and Russia need to think hard about these new dynamics and what they actually mean for our traditional notions of strategic stability between the two countries. So we're very privileged this evening to have here to discuss these issues with us Secretary William Perry. In just a moment, Jim Miller here is going to do an introduction of Secretary Perry, and the way we'll do this is we'll be involved in a conversation with the Secretary for about 45 minutes, and we'll open it up, part of that up to questions from you all. And then we're also privileged to have Celeste Wallander, who will join us up here on the stage, so to speak, and for a more open kind of panel discussion. So I'll turn it over to Jim Miller, who I think is well known to everyone here, senior fellow at the Belfer Center, president of Adaptive Strategies, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and co-author of these reports. So Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Bill Perry, a man who really needs no introduction to anyone in the room, or indeed anybody who knows anything about defense or national security policy in the United States, but he still deserves an introduction, so I would like to say a few words. To start with, literally where we are now, Dr. Perry was a founding director of the Center for New American Security, and along with Madeleine Albright, remains a director emeritus of the center. He's currently professor at Stanford University with a dual appointment in the School of Engineering and in the Institute for International Studies there. He continues to co-direct the Preventive Defense Project, and now also directs a new project that we'll talk a bit about tonight, the William J. Perry Project, which is focused on raising public information and knowledge and understanding about the nuclear threats that face the United States. Dr. Perry served as Secretary of Defense for President Bill Clinton, and prior to that, as Deputy Secretary. And in the Carter administration, as you all, or many of you know anyway, served as Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, where he was central to what's now known as the second offset, what then was just called the offset strategy, which was taking advantage of emerging technologies, including stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and various types of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to offset what was then the Soviet Union's great conventional military capability. We'll talk about that today, in part because some of the work that's underway on the so-called third offset, efforts to exploit cyber, space, long-range strike, missile defense, and so on, is now we believe having some potential impact on strategic stability. A couple of things I want to add as well. Something that I had known before, but until, frankly, I went back and looked at your bio, Bill, I had forgotten. Dr. Perry served in the Army as an enlisted man. He served in the occupation of Japan, and then as a reservist from 1950 to 55 as well. So his service to this nation goes back, obviously, decades. He's had multiple positions in the private sector, all about high tech, and he continues to lead in the private sector today. I made a list of the organizations to which he is a member, an honorary member or otherwise. I made a list of the awards which he's received, which start with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. If I went through those lists, that would be all we talked about tonight. So with that, I'm going to stop and just say how very pleased and honored we all are to have Bill Perry with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Sure. If I may, could we start with the Perry Project, the William J. Perry Project, which I've just explained to any who didn't know about it, is about raising public awareness. In this world of fake news, or so-called fake news, but clearly an era where, as you point out in your book, where people have somewhat forgotten about the history of the Cold War or have acted as if nuclear dangers have gone away with the end of the Cold War. It's obviously a big challenge. Could you speak to, in the broadest terms, I'm going to ask tougher questions later, but how things are going with the project, and as you think about how it relates to the other work that you are doing as well, including with the so-called four horsemen with the long-term goal of nuclear abolition.
And the project started with my perception that the danger of a nuclear catastrophe of some sort today is actually greater than it was during the Cold War. Greater. That's counterintuitive, but that's what I believe, and in my book I make the arguments why I believe that. And the second concern is that if I'm right, not very many people understand or believe that. And in any event, our policies do not reflect those dangers. And that led me to believe I ought to do something to try to inform and educate the public about it. I started off with a book a couple of years ago, and the book's called My Journey at the Nuclear Brink. It was a biography of sorts, but it was a biography focused on that part of my life, autobiography, that part of my life which dealt with nuclear weapons. I didn't talk about my childhood growing up and all those other things you might find in the biography. I focused strictly on what influenced my thinking about nuclear weapons, what led me to the conclusion about these dangers today.
Starting with the Cuban Missile Crisis and your role in it.
It really started when I was in the Army of Occupation in Japan.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
And so I went into enlisted in the Army and went with great enthusiasm about what a glorious thing war was. And then I saw what a war did. Okinawa, for example, where I spent most of my time in the occupation of Japan. The Battle of Okinawa was the last great battle of World War II. They had 100,000 Japanese troops based in that island, and 3 months later, when the fighting was over, fewer than 10,000 survived. I mean, greater than 90% fatality rate. Some of them killed in battle, many of them suicide. And that sort of set in mind military leaders at the time what the invasion of Japan was going to be like. If that's what happened on Okinawa, what was going to happen in Japan? Led them to believe there's going to be more than 1 million casualties, American casualties, not to mention many millions of Japanese. That had a significant factor in the decision to drop the nuclear bomb. And so that sort of led me into thinking about nuclear weapons. It's hard to describe the devastation that I saw on the island of Okinawa. I arrived just a few months after the fighting was over. It was just absolutely wasted. And it's the capital city of Naha. I don't believe there's a building left standing. So the fighting was enormously fierce. And it quickly disillusioned my views about the glamour and the glory of war when you saw the underside of it. But it also got me thinking about nuclear weapons, because this was just not many months after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I reflected, and I was also in Tokyo at the time, so what happened to Tokyo. And what I reflected is that Tokyo was destroyed by conventional bombs, but it took thousands of bombing missions, tens of thousands of bombs, and yet the same effect could be achieved with one bomb, one airplane, at a moment. And so then was when I started thinking about nuclear weapons. And then in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where I was actually on a small team, about 8 people, preparing an intelligence report for President Kennedy. What happened that day so he could make a decision about what to do the next day. The particular question, of course, was when would the Soviet missile be operational? So yeah, how much time did he have to work his diplomacy? I have to tell you that every day I went into that analysis center, I truly believed it was going to be my last day on Earth. And to this day, I think we escaped a tragedy, probably a civilization-ending tragedy in Cuba, as much by good luck as by good management. President Kennedy, after the crisis was over, said he thought there's a 1 chance in 3 that the missile crisis would end in a nuclear catastrophe. But he was optimistic. He didn't know the things we now know. For example, he didn't know that the Soviets already had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. And had he accepted what was the unanimous recommendation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and invaded Cuba with conventional forces, our troops would have been decimated on the beachhead with those tactical nukes, and a general nuclear war would surely have followed. So all of this led me to believe several things about the Cold War. First of all, it could lead in a catastrophe unlike anything the world had ever seen. As catastrophic as World War II was, it did not end civilization, whereas a nuclear war would end our civilization. And secondly, that we avoided that catastrophe more by good luck than by good management. I haven't mentioned the false alarms we were getting at that time, too. Another way which is almost precipitates into war. So I concluded then, and it's stuck with my mind for many years now, that we almost blundered into a nuclear war. And we're just lucky we didn't. But all the time I was in the Defense Department, we were focused on a totally different set of issues, not how to prevent blundering, how to prevent an accidental war, how to prevent a war by miscalculation. We were all focused on how to deal with a surprise attack from the Soviet Union. A bolt out of the blue. We loved it so much we had just one of the nickname, a boob. Our strategy was focused on dealing with the boob. Our weapons built and deployed were focused on how to deal with the boob. So I think, Jim, a question we should be asking really is, are there any lessons we can learn? First of all, are we in a new Cold War today? I'm happy to discuss. I think we are. It has a different dimensions to it in many ways, but it has all the bad characteristics of the Cold War, and it could end in the same disastrous way that could have ended. If we are, what lessons can we learn from the last Cold War? Are we still focusing our strategy? Are we still focusing our policies on how to respond to a boob, how to respond to a bolt out of the blue, a surprise strike? My retrospective view is that it was never the danger in the Cold War. And the best evidence for that is during the Cuban Missile Crisis, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted a nuclear war. Both of them did everything they could to prevent a nuclear war, but in spite of that, we damn near had one. We almost blundered into one. So I've come to believe then and now that what we should be focused on is how do we prevent a blunder? What can we do to lower the probability of a blunder? of a accidental war because of a false alarm, or of a miscalculation leading us to a war. And yet our policies don't seem to be focused on that at all. There are many things we could do, for example, to greatly reduce the possibility of a false alarm, but we're not doing them. And we're not doing them because we don't take it seriously, I think. We don't believe that that's the problem. We believe the problem is how to deal with a surprise attack. So if that's a lesson, that's what I learned in the Cold War. And the question, that's a real question, is that a lesson that can be used today as well? Mm-hmm. I think we seem to have learned the wrong lessons from the Cold War because we are repeating the Cold War and we're repeating the nuclear arms build-up that we did during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. So we're about to relive the Cold War. And shouldn't somebody just say, stop, let's rethink this? Are we really doing something pretty stupid?
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Richard, you want to go?
Yeah, let me follow up, Mr. Secretary. On one aspect of the kind of dangers of a nuclear exchange that you described, in the work that Jim and I have been doing, one of our contentions is that non-nuclear advances in technological capabilities can put pressure on strategic stability. So if you look at advances in cyber weapons, in counter space, missile defense, long-range strike, AI-related advances and so forth, even if not meaning to, it can put pressure on strategic stability. So a perfect example of this is early in a crisis or early in a conflict, there would be an incentive to go after the other side's satellites that are implicated in nuclear command and control rather than necessarily going after their forces themselves. Well, that could increase the use or lose pressures at the front end of that in ways that may not be totally appreciated now. I wanted to ask whether you share that general analysis and what you think the biggest threats to strategic stability are going to be as we get into the third offset kind of world.
Yeah, I have two different kinds of comments on that, Richard. And the first is that in contrast with the days of the Cold War, these new technologies really change in very profound ways how we would deal with a crisis, for example. I know the technologies which I believe are the most significant, one of them is, of course, cyber, very profoundly different. And the other, I would say, generally drones, particularly when you consider drones, how small they can be made and how they can be replicated in huge quantities. So between cyber and the newly emergent technology in drones, which could lead to cheaply making many thousands of them, I think these are profoundly different ways of thinking about these problems. But the second comment is quite different. It's as we look at the question of strategic stability and we look at scenarios that could lead to issues in which drones or cyber might be used, we should, I think, back up and ask the fundamental question. What is happening that's causing us to deal with these problems? Are we dealing with the Russia today, which is thinking about and planning to and seeking to find ways of destroying the United States? Are we looking at a Russia who is contemplating finding some sort of a military advantage so that it could conduct a surprise attack of some sort on us? And if so, why are they doing that and what advantage do they expect to get from it? I've raised the question that way because when I look back at the Cold War, I think our strategies and our policies were in error in fundamental ways because we were looking at the wrong threat. We were looking at the wrong set of dangers. We truly believed that the Soviet Union was planning a surprise attack to destroy the United States, and that the only reason they weren't conducting that attack was because we'd armed ourselves and we had strategies and policies and weapons that made that not likely to succeed. That's what deterrence was all about, is preventing what we presumed to be was a motive on the part of the Soviet Union. In retrospect, I don't think that was true, and I think it led us to a lot of wrong policies, dangerous policies. And so I think we got to go back to ask, as we look at today's situation, whether it's a Cold War II or whatever we want to call it, we look at today's situation, what is the danger? What's the overriding danger? Is it that Russia is seeking a way to attack and destroy the United States? It's very clear that they're doing things to disadvantage the United States in many ways, in many obnoxious ways. And the question that I'm asking then is, how deep is that? How far does it go? Are they really not attacking the United States with nuclear weapons because of our deterrence, or do they not see any advantage in doing that? I think somebody has to ask these more fundamental questions as well. If they are seeking to do that, and it's only our deterrence that's keeping them from doing that, then that puts the answer to the question of strategic stability one way. If they're not, then we need to be looking at it a different way. So I want to raise that fundamental question in contemplation here. I've read the reports you've written here, and it seems to me the reports implicitly assume that the Russia, were they able to, might very well use their power to destroy the United States. I don't believe that's true.
Dr. Perry, if I can?
Yeah.
That's not my view.
Okay. Tell me what it is.
So and I'll frame it a slightly different way
Okay.
and see if it resonates with you. You've been an advocate for Global Zero, and I have supported that as a long-term objective. We can talk about in ways in which it's moving further away and getting closer, but for the near to midterm, it seems to me, and I think to Richard as well, that we're stuck in a situation of mutual vulnerability or mutual assured destruction, whatever you want to call it, with respect to Russia, and and what that implies is each side having secure second strike capabilities. It doesn't mean that every day we wake up and wonder if there's going to be an attack from Russia. I think that's implausible, and so I don't. It's certainly not a premise for me. But it's if in a situation where I guess we are stuck, in my view, with Matt. I'll ask you if you believe that, or mutual assured destruction, mutual vulnerability, whatever you care to call it, pending any reductions deep enough to actually make a difference in terms of whether you could tell the difference. I can't imagine one could tell the difference between 1,000 or 2,000 nuclear warheads, or perhaps 700 or 1,000, or et cetera, right? But we're above that threshold today, and so given that, our thought was, let's reinforce the stability of that arrangement, and in my view, some of the steps that are consistent with that are one that you highlighted in your last piece as part of the Four Horsemen, and that you highlighted toward the end of your book, which is, we used to call it lengthening the fuse, but getting more decision time, moving systematically away from launch under attack. And so I guess the way I turned my speech into a question: are we stuck with MAD for the near term? And if so, should we work to stabilize it? And if the answer is yes, then I have notions and ideas, and Richard does as well. I'd love to get your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think my answer to your question is yes, we are. But, and here's the big but, what you'll be doing about that, I think we should be doing to get ourselves out of that situation. It's a very dangerous situation. We should be working to get ourselves, not digging ourselves in deeper. We're in a hole. We shouldn't be digging the hole deeper. We should be trying to find a way of getting out of that hole. And while we're in that hole, trying to decrease the danger of that position. And that would put my focus on things like, how do we get away from this low probability, but very dangerous probability, of responding to a false alarm? I don't see much attention or interest in that at all. And I think more fundamentally, a report which you address, an issue which you address quite well, I think, in your report, is how do we geopolitically get out of that hole? How do we reopen the dialogue with Russia? Are we fundamentally doomed to be in a conflict with Russia? And I don't believe that's the case. So what should we be doing to try to dig ourselves out of that hole, both technically and geopolitically? I do agree we're in that hole. But I see it as a disastrous situation. I want to find a way of getting out of it, not a way of digging ourselves in deeper.
Mr. Secretary, one of the ways that arguably you could address how close to possible catastrophic failure of this arrangement would be to require more than one person to have authority to launch nuclear weapons. And in fact, Senator Corker had the first hearing in some 40 years to address precisely this, and it's a pretty controversial premise to say that you would establish different scenarios under which the president would or would not have the sole authority to launch. What is your view on that and the best way to make those arrangements?
I think it's fair to say that the legislation proposed was probably inspired by concern that President Trump might make a wrong decision. But to me, the issue goes far beyond any particular president we have. I don't think, if I think particular about responding to an attack of a missile warning, I don't think any person should have to make a decision like that in 5 or 10 minutes. I just think it's a very unreasonable situation. I've lived through 2 of them. As it happened, the 3 false alarms in the United States have 2 of them happened when I was Undersecretary. The 4 years I was Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And one of them I actually received a phone call. Stupid.
That's perfect timing. However you arrange that is really impressive.
That's impressive.
There it is now.
My name is Joe, and I'm a hearing administrator on a recorded line. How are you today?
But when that call comes in, we've been lucky in the 3 times this happened, and 2 times I've personally familiar with, we had a very astute watch officer. You'd like to believe that's always going to be the case, but you can't assume that's always going to be the case. And he didn't follow instructions to call the president. He came to his own conclusion that was a false alarm, although it looked pretty real in some respects. And incidentally, that happened in Russia at least once that we know about in 1992, and that's the subject of the documentary, The Man Who Saved the World. And again, the colonel, Russian colonel in this case, who was on watch that night, decided not to send the warning to President Brezhnev, or God knows what would have happened had he sent it to Brezhnev in the middle of the night. It's noteworthy, I think, that his reward for having saved the world is he was reprimanded for not having followed orders, instructions. But this is a bad situation. It's a stupid situation, really, when you think about it. They put the whole fate of the world on this one watch officer, or the president being awoken at 3 in the morning making the right decision without much advice or much input, or much, importantly, without much context. The other thing that saved us in those 2 situations, in the U.S. and the one in Russia, was the context. There was nothing going on in the world at that time. But just ask yourself, what if those 2 false alarms that I was familiar with had occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or had occurred during one of my Mideast crises when we were in high alert? I think the watch officer would have felt obliged to send this message on to the president. And then we've had a variety of presidents over the last many decades. Some of them might have made the right decision, some might have made the wrong decision. Who knows? I don't want to single out any particular president. I said that's the decision that no president should have to make. So we should posture ourselves so that we do not have to respond in 10 minutes. We don't have to press the button that starts the nuclear war on the basis of a 10-minute decision. So in a sense, the Corker hearing was on that issue. I did not attend the hearing, but I read a good many of the reports about the hearing. And in my judgment, the hearing came to the wrong conclusion, which was not to worry. Our military has the right not to follow an illegal order, is basically what they said. Well, they have that right, but will they exercise that right? Who knows? I'm as much concerned about that issue as I would be concerned about the president making the right decision. So I don't like the conclusion. My conclusion is we should not put a president in the position of having to make that kind of a decision. And that has to do with our view of what our threats are, which I talked about earlier, and it has to do with how we're willing to respond to a warning if it does come in. My judgment being we have to write it out to be sure that it's an attack. whoever the president is. And whatever downsides that may, because that downside pales in comparison with the downside of accidentally starting a war which ends our civilization.
Could I follow directly on
Yeah,
that?
please.
We'll go,
And then-
if it's all right, go to the technical side a bit and then plan to come back to Russia when Celeste's up here as well. If that is your principal or a key objective, Dr. Perry, you want survivable nuclear command and control, or that can be reconstituted in some form anyway, and at least one highly survivable delivery system. And today the most survivable obviously is the SSBNs for us, probably mobile missiles for Russia. Now, it makes, so based on your analysis, it seems that it makes sense to certainly make those investments. I would argue that the bombers are not a very great first strike threat and are a key part of a hedge against any problem with the boomers. But I'm going to get into something that goes back to one of your Four Horsemen colleagues in the Senate back in the old days, and that was the case for a mobile ICBM. The principal case to launch under attack is to preserve ICBMs. To some degree, you could argue for nuclear command and control, but it's historically been for ICBMs. Wouldn't a small mobile, I'm leading the witness a little bit here, I'm sorry. Would a small mobile force, and I see Rudy's here who was staff director in House Armed Services at this time as well for Les Aspin, would a small mobile force or some kind of survivable land-based force make sense if, as a hedge, if we just don't want to put all of our eggs in that submarine basket?
Of course, we have a mobile ICBM, and it's called an SLBM. And the question is, why do we need them on the ground as well as in the sea? And the answer to that is if you're worried about somebody being able to attack them. Back when I was the Undersecretary of Defense in 1978, I was worried about that. We were always imagining some way that the Soviet Union was going to make some technological breakthrough to make the oceans transparent and be able to see our submarines. Those days, what we worried about was so-called blue-green lasers, which turned out to be not really as effective as people thought they might be. Nowadays, we're worried about flooding the ocean with thousands of underwater drones. I'm enough of a technical nut that I would never say never, that we're never going to be able to do that. But it's sure been a hell of a long time trying to do it with billions of resources put into trying to find a way of making our submarines more vulnerable. And also contemplating the fact that as the submarine sees countermeasures developing, it also has countermeasures it can consider. I think on balance, the advantage is going to be with the submarines on that major countermeasure battle that's going ahead. So I'd have a lot of confidence in them. If we were worried about that, then we only have one hedge, which is the bombers, that we have to configure them differently than they're now configured if you get worried on that issue. We did during the Cold War, we actually had them airborne alert, which is a bad idea for a lot of reasons. They kept falling out of the ground, and that turns out to be unnerving to the people on the ground when nuclear bombs land, even if they don't explode. But we also had them on ground-based but on high alert. That's not a bad thing to consider, I think. I hate to be so negative about ICBM. I only have one problem with ICBM. They're so susceptible to the false alarm. Because the false alarm is not a problem if you can write it out. But people worry about writing it out with the submarines and the silos because, of course, the silos are all known locations. And the Russians now have accurate system guidance systems accurate enough to hit them on the silos. So that's why I worry about the ICBM. Now, if you put the ICBMs on a railroad or a highway or something, I spent a couple of years of my life trying to design a system to do that. The system was called the MX. That was the most frustrating 2 years of my life, I must say. Every damn system we come up with, there's something wrong with it. And I finally gave up in frustration. That's the only major technical problem I gave up on. That one I gave up on. The last one we looked at was involved putting 300 MXs, or 200, I guess it was, in Utah with 2,000 silos. and then moving the missiles down from silos. It was a great idea, except the people in Utah didn't like that idea very well. So that one got squashed. And when I finally went out of office with my tail between my legs on that problem, the new administration said, we're going to fix this problem. And they came up with something called dense pack, which also turned out to have serious flaws. The upshot of all of these moves to find a way of making that ICBM secure from attack, most of them being mobile systems like you're thinking about here, was that we finally just deployed DMXs in single silos. And the first time we started reducing weapons, we undeployed DMX.
Yes.
I still think the best solution to the problem is the one which we finally come up with, which is single warhead ICBMs, which we've done. But now originally the Soviets did, but now the Russians are going back to 10 warhead merged system, which is really a bad idea.
Agree.
But we don't have much influence over what they do. So, in concept, the mobile ICBM, I think, is good. I have to say that when it came down to actually building one that was acceptable to the body politic and the technical, various technical issues you had to work by, we never found one. And I'll tell you, we had very capable people working very many years trying to do that. So when I read your comment about mobile ICBM, all I can say is that it's a good idea in theory, but in practice, I doubt it's going to work in the United States. That because besides technical problems with the mobile ICBM, you have really serious political problems. There was nothing technically wrong with that 2,000 silo, 200 missile solution. It was a political problem, and it was a very serious political problem. The people of Utah did not want 2,000 silos in their state, and they were pretty clear about that, and their voice was heard all the way to Washington, D.C. So.
Thank you. I'll just say, and I don't want to try to have the last word, but I think a single warhead off-road mobile ICBM seems plausible as at least as a hedge program in
Yes,
the event.
I think technically there's nothing wrong with it if you can sell it politically. So
politically hard.
I have no problems with the ICBM except their fixed location.
Yes, fair enough.
Okay, and if you can find a way, and certainly technically you can make them mobile in either roads or trains like the Russians are doing. And if you can find a political way of selling that, I think it's not a bad idea.
Mr. Secretary, let me ask you one more question, then maybe we can bring Celeste up here and sort of open up the conversation to more of a panel discussion. But you've argued against nuclear-tipped cruise missiles like the LRSO. One notion of those is that bombers and air-launched cruise missiles are a second strike capability. What is your concern with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, and how do you've come out pretty forcefully against this concept? What's the basis of your thinking?
I do, but I'm put it in perspective. Compared to the ICBM problem, I think it's a secondary problem. The big problem in my judgment is the ICBM, because it really can trigger. They really could trigger an accidental war. That's my big concern with the ICBMs. The same theoretical argument could be made about the nuclear-tipped cruise missiles because of the ambiguity with the conventional tipped cruise missiles. But I think it's a much lower probability of that being a problem, I think. So it's a problem which I think we don't have to face, and therefore I've argued against it. But I would not compare it with the problem of the ICBMs. I think it's much more serious.
Great. Why don't I invite Celeste to join us?
Oh, excuse me. One other thing.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And I also want to emphasize the importance of our conventionally based cruise missiles. I wouldn't want to do anything which would degrade the importance and the deployment of those weapons. I think they're a very fundamental part of our conventional military strategy.
Yeah. Celeste? Celeste Wallander, someone I think well known to everyone, certainly in this room. Celeste, while she gets mic'd up, I'll just let you know a couple of lines of her biography. She's president and CEO of the U.S. Russia Foundation for Economic Advancement and the Rule of Law, aka USRF. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and then she was on the National Security Council staff, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia and Central Asia. So we're very privileged to have Celeste join us. We're now going to kind of morph things just a little bit. So I'm going to turn into just a moderator, but these three are going to have a conversation about some of the issues that we have been talking to Secretary Perry about and other things. And we'll do this for a little while, and then we'll open it up to questions. But Celeste, let me start with you. And actually, I want to go back to something Secretary Perry raised about the character of what Russia wants in its relationship with the United States. I mean, he says, does Russia really want military advantage over the United States for a surprise attack? Does it really want to destroy the United States? So, or are we configured for the wrong threat out of Russia? How do you think about this?
Right. Well, first, let me thank you for including me. It's great, especially to be in a conversation with Jim again, because when I served at the Pentagon, I served with Jim and for Jim. So it's a great privilege, and I, of course, have long admired Secretary Perry. So thank you very much, Richard, for including me. I think the most important thing to understand about Russian threat perception and security analysis is that at the center of Russian threat perception is the belief that the United States is intent on encircling, weakening, and coercing the Russian Federation, and in particular that at the center of U.S. security policy and national intentions towards Russia is regime change. They don't just say this, they believe it. They believe that U.S. security policy in general is focused on changing regimes of countries that we don't like or we don't like their policies. They came up themselves with the term color revolution, but they now attribute it to us as a strategy. They tend to see, the Kremlin tends to see the overthrow of leaders in places like Libya, Iraq, potentially North Korea, entirely through a frame that this is kind of all practice for Moscow. And it's how they saw the conflict in Ukraine as well, that this was a successful operation, even though they know this isn't true. But they've now convinced themselves that this was a successful operation to get rid of a Ukrainian leader who was not adapting to American national security interests. And so I think that says two things relevant to the conversation here. Number one is that this is not just some misunderstanding. I mean, this is a fundamental belief that the Putin leadership, and not just Putin, but the people around Putin, the system of political and economic rule in Russia, we do call Putinism, is entrenched. It is a deeply held belief, and they see evidence for it everywhere they turn. It is hard to disabuse them of this notion. And I will say that President Obama, on numerous occasions, when President Putin would allude to this, would try to disabuse him of this belief to little effect, which isn't to say that we shouldn't keep saying it, but I want you to understand that this is a real problem for a generation of dealing with the Russian leadership that is convinced of it and has convinced its society that this is at the core of U.S. security policy. And on the encirclement, weakening, and coercing, the Russian security elite, the Putin leadership, but also the intelligence communities and the military communities, believe and see a pattern of U.S. presence throughout Eurasia, and by Eurasia I mean the continent of Europe and Asia, that is meant to deny Russia allies, advantage, presence, running room, operating room, and they again can see a pattern of American intervention in Afghanistan, American intervention in Iraq, attempt to overthrow Assad. All this came together in the Syria conflict. And so there is a tendency to see that American presence in terms not of, we see it in disconnected ways. Oh no, there's a counterterrorism need popping up in Afghanistan because of Al-Qaeda. Oh, ISIS now is in a different part of the Eurasian land space. But instead is an integrated strategy to create presence, to create potential and advantage with the ultimate goal, not fighting terrorism, not cooperating with like-minded partners, but to encircle and weaken and constrain the Russian Federation. I'm not talking about this at great length because I think we should accept this view, or I'm telling you we all have to back off. But I think it's really important to understand this, and it speaks to what Secretary Perry was saying, which is that it's not waiting for a bolt from a blue opportunity to destroy us. But But that doesn't make it that does not make it easier, and in many ways it makes it harder. And I don't want to talk too much now, but I think that actually the first thing we need to do is understand this dilemma and this challenge, and then understand why in many ways it is more dangerous than the Cold War. Because you now have a Russian military which is invested in conventional capabilities and the ability to intervene effectively on Russia's Eurasian borders, whether that's in Ukraine, whether that's in Syria. It may come to be in Afghanistan. Again, I don't know, but it may be. It's certainly in Central Asia. So you have a Russian military that is able to intervene, has highly capable conventional forces, not with global reach, but certainly with Eurasian reach, and Eurasia is a big place, and a political leadership that is willing to use military force and sees it as a necessary step to ensure regime survival, which then is defined as national strength and national survival. And that's, I think, where the danger lies more. And I think that's something that we have to deal with and address in this discussion.
That's great. Let me just follow up with you, Celeste, on one thing. So the Russians seem to have been making progress, certainly, as you're saying, on the conventional modernization side and the willingness to use their conventional military force capabilities. Certainly on the unconventional side, because of their ability and willingness to use information operations and special operations forces and, this kind of gray zone stuff. But one reads often about their, within Russian military doctrine, increasing interest in and potential use of nuclear escalation as a way of deterrence, beyond sort of strategic deterrence, but as a way of signaling that, the United States or others should just back off if we get into a crisis and things like that. How are the Russians thinking about the role of their nuclear arsenal and potential escalation to the purposes that you were describing, they're sort of oriented toward?
So I think at the core of Russian security thinking on this issue is it's also important to understand they're pretty confident that they now have a secure second strike capability. They're pretty confident that we have a secure second strike capability. There are trends going forward we could talk more about where they're concerned about technologies and operations on the U.S. side that might change that situation. That's not the problem. The problem at the core of a lot of Russian military thinking is exactly that we're at a standoff at the nuclear level, and the United States is much more advanced with global conventional reach, including cruise missiles, including technologies we haven't even developed yet, but we've talked a lot about, like prompt global strike. And the sort of nightmare scenario for Russian wargaming, as it were, would be that the United States intervenes in a conflict on Russia's borders or even within Russia, keeps it successfully at a conventional level, and sort of takes away the option from the Russian leadership to use that ultimate deterrent counterstrike of nuclear weapons to force us to stand down. And so the development of usable nuclear options is to deny us what they believe is a strategy or strategic option that we've developed to be able to intervene successfully against Russia or against Russian interests and prevail at the conventional level in a Eurasian conflict. And so those capabilities, which are nuclear and also are in new technologies, are meant to let us know that, no, you can't do that. You can't prevail, you can't coerce us, you can't force us to stand down by keeping this only in a military domain where you have the advantage. We can act asymmetrically and put you at a disadvantage and not have to be coerced and stand down in a crisis. And that's why those options have been generated in Russian security thinking.
Yep, okay.
Richard, I think the situation is just as bad as Celeste has described it. I would sign up to that description. But I also note that in the report that Richard writes, he calls out for trying to a renewed dialogue with Russia, partly to try to reduce the danger of some of those problems, trying to solve some of those problems. And I think it's a fair question, is there any chance of success of that kind of dialogue? The reason I am hopeful that there is because this hasn't always been the case. Up until, I don't know the right year, 2004, 2005, we had reasonably good relations with Russia. And this was many years after Putin came in power. And somewhere around that time, a set of actions that we were taking flipped some sort of a switch in Putin's mind. He's been on the negatives of the U.S. ever since then and doing everything he can to harm the U.S. It's worth looking back at that history and say, what did we do that put him in that frame of mind? If we're going to try to get a dialogue with him to improve things, we got to first of all understand what got us in the bad situation in the first place. And there were a set of actions we were taking then. One of them was expanding NATO to the border, which they didn't like at all. Another was deploying BMD systems near the borders, which they didn't like at all. And it wasn't that these were good ideas or bad ideas. That's when they complained about them, we just brushed them off. Basically, our answer is, what can you do about it? You're a second-rate economic power. We don't have to pay attention to what you think. Now, I'm oversimplifying it for dramatic effect. People didn't say that to him in so many words. But that was the effect of it. We don't care what you think because you can't do anything about it. And somewhere about 2004 or 5 or 6, Putin decided that was enough. He was going to find a way of doing something about it. And now when we ask him, what can you do about it, we get the answer. He does a lot of things he can do about it that were well described by Celeste. If that is a reasonable analysis of how we got into this bad geopolitics with Russia, then getting to Jim's point in his report about how do we get out of it, what should the goal of the dialogue be? And I think those particular issues which were getting them so angry with us, it wasn't so much about the issue as it was about disrespecting them, calling them a second-rate economic power, brushing them off. What can you do about it? So I think we have to, and if we do enter into dialogue, we have to start off from a position of respect. And that's going to be very hard to do, I think, because we really end with a more feeling of anger. We're angry about the things they've done to us in the last few years, and I think rightfully so. But to be successful in this dialogue, to be successful in diplomacy, we have to set that aside and say they have some reasons for doing what they're doing. We contributed to those reasons. Part of what we didn't contribute to them was disrespecting them. So let's start off the dialogue on a positive, constructive basis. I think it's going to be a very hard diplomacy, very hard dialogue. But I really think we ought to try, and we ought to try understanding that we did something to get us in the mess we're in right now.
Jim, let me pick up on this point and ask you. I mean, it seems to me that potential dialogue with Russia could take several levels. One is this sort of geopolitical level and returning to first principles and where we started and how we got here and the status and the respect with which we deal with Russia and all these other things. Another is more bounded, but also gets in some ways at the heart of some of the things we're talking about tonight, and that is on some of these new dynamics surrounding the kinds of technologies that are putting new pressures on stability. So, you know, in the things that we've been writing, we talk specifically about that kind of dialogue. You know, should we aim for some sort of rules of the road on conduct in cyberspace, or is that even feasible? Should we aim for you know, rules of the road when it comes to conduct in outer space, maneuvering satellites closer to another side's satellites, or pre-positioning destructive cyber implants in the military systems of the other side? Mm-hmm. These kinds of things. So how feasible do you think some dialogue like that would be in actually producing some positive outcome? And then how desirable do you think that is, given that we have such a competitive relationship in the other domains?
I'm going to harken back to Secretary Perry's comments about U.S. domestic politics a bit in answering this. And the one thing that I think would be detrimental would be if one administration attempts to push out in ways that are not sustainable over time with the American people and with the Congress, whether it's on a specific initiative for cyber or space, or whether it's about the future of strategic stability, or whether it's about the broader political relationship. So at the top of my list would be for the United States, and I think Congress really does have to play a central role here, is to get our ducks in a row about what is our policy toward Russia. Obviously, it would be desirable for this administration to put out a clear set of policies with respect to Russia, because in my view, it's not been it's not been consistent in the statements that different parts of the administration have made, including or particularly the president. So having that a clear set of policies that looks like it's sustainable within an administration over time is part one, and then I would include everything that you talked about. First is the questions of the political relationship, and in addition to past grievances, looking for positive areas of cooperation. We see that in pockets, but it's interesting that, frankly, we've had a program for seeking areas of cooperation, including military to military with the PRC. With China for some time, it's part of how we do our mill-to-mill exchanges, in part because those exchanges have been curtailed with respect to Russia, but more broadly because of the relationship that Secretary Perry talked about. That agenda is not there. So having that agenda at the political level and including with military contacts as well is part one. And that should be relatively straightforward. The policy is to turn the dial up and seek areas of cooperation. On the question, just to jump to the technical side, on the question of cyber or space rules of the road, or is this a real issue? I'll just say Celeste joined me in numerous meetings with now the Russian ambassador, previously Deputy Defense Minister Antonov, a very intelligent, capable person, just making the case on one of those issues, and that was on missile defense. Principle one, again, is get a set of approaches that are sustainable within the United States on these issues, which we did have at that time on missile defense. And that will be challenging on cyber and space because we haven't had a very good national dialogue on these issues yet. Nothing compared to the post-World War II dialogue on nuclear weapons, and nothing compared to the type of analysis and thinking that was done on nukes. And I think that we need that on cyber and space, and I don't think that classification is an adequate justification for not having that national dialogue. So, getting our ducks in the row on the political side and on the technical side, and then having a program, because it's not going to show progress in a week or a month or a year. It's a long-term campaign, and I agree with Secretary Perry. Our words and our actions need to show that we take seriously the concerns and legitimacy of Russia, and at the same time, my guess is we have some near-term friction, which I think is unavoidable as we respond to their hack of our election, because that can't, in my view, can't go unanswered, and economic sanctions is at least a necessary step.
Jim, they've done so many things that we're angry about, rightfully so, I think. It's hard to imagine how the dialogue is going to get underway, and the only way I can see, if you set aside the things which are mutually advantageous to both countries. In the nuclear field, it's pretty clear. Neither side wants a nuclear war. Neither side wants nuclear proliferation. Neither side wants nuclear terrorism. That's really unquestioned. And it's pretty clear that we could achieve those mutual goals better if we work together on them. So we can point to an area where it makes sense to work together in dialogue, to work to achieve mutual objectives. But that we don't do that because what gets in the way is all these things that they're doing we don't agree on, and where they're really setting out to try to make our life miserable. So unless you expect that all to stop, you're not going to get the dialogue on it with that problem. So I have argued, and I will argue again, to have success here, we have to be able to somehow separate out those different issues. It's what mathematicians call separation of variables. You work on the problems that you have reason to agree on, and you have some chance of success, and you simply set aside the ones that you don't agree on. It's politically very hard to do that. It's psychologically very hard to do that. I don't see any success in the dialogue with Russia until we're able to effect that kind of a separation. But if we can do that, we could accomplish really positive things in the nuclear field, because we don't disagree fundamentally, I think, in the nuclear field. And we might be able to get good rules of the road at the same time. I think both of those are important objectives where we could make some real progress if we could only set aside all these obnoxious things they're doing that bug us. And they have some things that we're doing that bug them too, but somehow you have to set those aside and say, those are important problems, someday we'll work on them, but let's work now on things where we do agree, where we might be able to make quick progress.
Celeste, I'm sure you have a view on this, but as a practical matter, could we have a dialogue with the Russians where, for example, we're talking about cyber rules of the road with respect to planting beacons in each other's critical infrastructure, but not cyber rules of the road that have to do with hacking each other's democratic systems to the detriment of our democracy? I mean, how feasible is that?
So the way I frame it, although I hesitate because I'm sitting next to Secretary Perry, who's part of the history of making this, is I remind people, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, there wasn't this nirvana world where the Soviet Union and the United States agreed that mutual vulnerability and assured destruction was the right way to strategic stability. Certainly, it was debatable on the U.S. side whether everyone agreed that that was a good way forward. On the Russian-Soviet side, the idea of the value of being vulnerable to American nuclear strike was something they did not accept. And it was through a process of beginning to talk about this, in part after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that you finally got to a basis for arms control at the end of the 1960s. I feel like we're in the late 1950s right now. And until the last year or so, and I give the Center for New American Security huge credit for the studies you've done, and others in this room are contributing to this. The Russians would raise concerns about strategic stability, and the typical American answer was, oh, you have a secure second strike capability. Just, don't worry. And we weren't listening to them. We weren't listening to their concerns about prompt global strike, about missile defense, even limited regional missile defense capabilities, about space weapons. And we've begun now to say, well, maybe we should talk to them and listen to them about it. So I feel like the first step is not to have necessarily a negotiation on nuclear systems or cyber agreements. We are not close to that. There's not enough trust, there's not enough understanding, and I think that what we really need to do is have those conversations among experts, and I was very pleased. We worked on trying to get this done, but we ran out of time in the Obama administration. I was very pleased that the Trump administration did send a team to talk to the Russian experts on these issues in late September, and that needs to be continued, because that we actually don't know what looks, I think, maybe you guys do, what looks stabilizing in the cyber realm. We're just at the beginning, and I'm pretty sure Russian thinkers haven't got there yet, and if we come to the table and we're willing to not just tell them what we think, but try to understand, we don't have to agree with them, but we have to listen to what they think, we might be able to create a basis for then down the road finding out ways that we can solve the problems each of us are putting on the table and are worried about.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, part of the thing that in this next report, once DoD's done reviewing it for security violations or whatever, that Jim and I are recommending is actually to devote more analytical resources to our own side, figuring out how these dynamics play out. And I don't think there's the answer that we have and the answer that they have, and we just are going to get together and either agree or disagree or find somewhere in the middle. But it's precisely what you say, is that we're on the front edge of understanding this, and so that's the conversation that needs ultimately to take place. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn to you guys, so be thinking of your brilliant questions for the panel. INF treaty violations by the Russians, how should the United States respond? Secretary Perry?
Let me ask Celeste on that first. She's more familiar with that problem than I am.
Okay.
About what's actually been done on it.
So I am a very deep believer in arms control. When I was a professor and academic, I wrote, contrary to some of the realist theorists, that arms control is a rational choice, self-interested security policy under certain circumstances. Those circumstances, though, include the credibility of commitments that you make in an arms control agreement, and they include that if violations are uncovered, you don't take the sucker payment, which is to continue to live by an agreement the other side is violating. Now, that's abstract and rational choice in a nice game theory structure. The reality is you're not going to walk away from the table immediately because the stakes are high. And so you do need to not just say, technical violation, we're out. But I do think we have to take seriously those who believe in arms control going forward. You need the Russian leadership to know that if it cheats, it will pay a price. Exactly what that price will be, in terms of new American systems, new deployments, discussions with allies in NATO, discussions with the Chinese, because the Russian INF violation is something the Chinese should be really worried about and paying attention to, because those missiles can't hit the American homeland, but they can hit China. But I think you have to take it seriously, not because you're against arms control, but because you believe that ultimately the answer is to get back to a reasonable arms control framework with Russia that addresses all these new technologies. How could you do an agreement on confidence and limitations in the cyber realm when you haven't addressed an existing arms control violation? So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Jim, do you want to add?
I would just add one point, and that is that referring back to a different use of a concept that Secretary Perry talked about, we should insulate the New START treaty from this. I do think we need to increase the cost to Russia for its violation and give them time to come back into compliance with the INF treaty. I think it's inherently valuable. I believe the New START treaty should not be thrown onto that and freighted because while the limitations are relatively modest compared to what each side had before, they're still valuable. But more importantly, the 18 inspections and data exchanges that we have with Russia are valuable to us and help to avoid worst-case planning and thinking. And it's also incredibly important symbolically. If we can't keep a strategic arms treaty in place, it's a sign that it will contribute to the further degradation of the relationship.
Richard, I really agree with both what Celeste and Jim said, that we have to take this seriously. There has to be recognized, there has to be some price. I don't think the price is responding in kind. I mean, we're in a hole now, that's digging the hole deeper approach. I think we ought to find another way of responding. And I think certainly I would agree with Jim that we ought to insulate the New START treaty from this, where as far as I know, there are no indications of cheating on either side. So hold this New START treaty, proceed forward and try to proceed forward to get it renewed when the appropriate time. Secondly, hold firm to a position. I don't have a way of assessing the intelligence on this, Celeste, but assuming the intelligence is right.
Right.
Assuming that's right, then I think we cannot just look the other way. We have to call them. And we have to have some way of being specific about the price that's paid for it. I'm just arguing it should not be our doing the same thing, because I think that's counterproductive. And because I don't think we need to.
All right, thank you. Okay, questions? Just signal if you want to ask something. I see a hand in the back there. Let's go there. Do we have a microphone?
A mic's coming.
Mic's coming, so just introduce yourself and fire away.
Hi, it's an honor to ask a question to all of you. My name is Mark Bessman. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think about the likelihood of the reunification of the western and eastern portions of Ukraine with the crisis going on there, especially with Russia, Europe, and the United States.
All right.
I can hear it.
The question is the prospects for the full reunification of Ukraine?
The likelihood.
The likelihood, okay.
Are we-
I guess we're leaving Crimea out of that for
Are you-
the time being. I think the prospects of that are zero, but that's an editorial comment in the near term. Celeste, do you want to take a stab?
Well, again, I'm glad that the Trump administration decided to appoint a special envoy to continue the negotiations on trying to get implementation of the Minsk agreement. Kurt Volker is a brave soldier to take that on, and I know that he's takes it very seriously. I think the problem is that right now what you have is you have an agreement, the Minsk agreement, which, if implemented in detail, would result in that outcome. And I don't think the Kremlin has decided yet that it's ready to actually implement that outcome. As I understand the negotiations between Kurt Volker and the Russian counterpart, that the Russians are still trying to walk back from the obligations that would result in Ukraine taking international control eventually of a region that would have greater autonomy, greater local government, probably leaders elected who don't like Kyiv, who sort of are more pro-Russian but would be under Ukrainian sovereignty. And I don't think there's any signs that they're done yet. And I wish I was saying something else, but that doesn't mean that you give up. I mean, because that's the only really acceptable outcome in the long run. But I think it's going to take considerably longer.
Yes, sir. Right here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for an excellent discussion. My name is Terence Taylor. I wondered if I realize that this discussion is centered on the U.S. Russia relationship. I get that point. But, of course, the nuclear dangers are global, and there are other players in South Asia, North Korea, and so on. And I wondered, given if we accept the argument that neither Russia nor the United States want to enter into attack each other with nuclear weapons, I think that's a solid place. Isn't there a point of entry with the discussion with Russia on global nuclear dangers in having a discussion which is global in its context, not just about the US and Russia itself, although there are technical discussions, I think, that would be important in that context. But I'm just thinking, would that be an entry point? And I wonder what your view would be. Thank you.
I think that would be the main point of entry. Seems to me that that's what we have most in common with Russia. And we should approach the discussion on nuclear issues with Russia by focusing on the global issue and how we can work together to reduce the danger to both countries. I agree completely. Jim?
No, just as Secretary Perry said earlier, that includes countering nuclear terrorism, includes countering nuclear proliferation, including following through on the. Obviously, I was part of the administration, so it may sound self-serving. It wasn't my. It wasn't my doing. The work on fissile material control that was done. There's a lot more work to be done, and it's a natural area and it's an important area of cooperation between the United States and Russia, and as you suggest, with others as well.
It's interesting to note, though, Jim, that even in that relatively non-controversial area, the Russians elected not to attend the last meeting as some sort of a political statement. So we've got to get around that somehow. But that was an area which was a perfect example of what we're talking about, and yet we somehow couldn't quite pull it off.
Exactly right.
Yes, sir. Back there.
Eric Polofsky had the honor to serve with Celeste, and I thank all three of you for your service. My question is sort of, as we anticipate the Mueller report and the investigation going forward, is there any way to insulate the relationship or to put it on a better foundation in anticipation of what will obviously be even more tumultuous months to come?
I didn't hear the question.
So as the Mueller investigation continues, is there a way to insulate the U.S.-Russia relationship from the kind of domestic stuff that's about to unleash
I have
potentially?
The answer is no.
All right, so we've got a firm no here.
Desirable but not probable.
Jim, do you have a more optimistic?
I think not much, but as I mentioned before, I think the administration putting out a clear set of policies toward Russia, seeking to get congressional support on those policies, and including the responses to the election hack and a commitment to and a commitment to look for other areas of cooperation, as we've discussed. Having that put out, I think, while not an insulation entirely, would help to could be a bit of a shock absorber and create a little bit more predictability as the Russians look at the United States. I'm not optimistic that that's about to happen. I think I think it's possible for our system to do that, and it would be desirable, and it would help.
Jim, one thing we might be able to do is get some expert talks going. But big political decisions between our leaders, I don't think it's really going to be feasible for some time to come.
I agree.
Yes, sir. Right here. Right here in the front.
Tom Cleanup, Plowshares Fund. Thank you very much for all your remarks. Dr. Perry, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned before, which was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing from a few weeks ago on presidential use authority. And you said that the wrong message or the wrong lesson was learned from that hearing. That really the lesson that was learned was that senior military leaders could declare the launch authority or the launch order illegal and therefore stop it. I'm wondering if you could drill down a little deeper and tell us why you think that was the wrong lesson and what should have come out of that hearing. For example, should there have been someone talking for no first use or something along those lines that would get to the issue of what do you do with a president, probably not in response to an attack, but with first use launch authority? How do you have limits on that? Do you want limits on that? Thank you.
Yeah, there was a lot of focus in that hearing on sort of a rogue president approach. It seemed to me the focus should have been on the president being confronted with an issue, a decision to launch, where he just didn't have enough information to make the judgment. And the classic example of that is the false alarm coming in. A way of avoiding an accidental war is restricting the president from not being able to launch until impact occurs. I don't imagine that ever being passed. It seems to me beyond belief that that's ever going to happen, which is why I look for alternative solutions to that problem.
In other words, posturing our forces and our nuclear command and control so that the president would not have to make that choice.
So that the launch them or lose them problem doesn't exist. If you can get around that problem, then this tends to become less of a dangerous issue.
And it seems that this issue of an illegal order kind of misses the point. I mean, no military officer has the ability to execute an illegal order. They have to refuse an illegal order. But what does an illegal nuclear order look like? It questions what the wisdom
who
of
decide? I mean, does the launch control officer decide? Does the SAC general decide? I mean, I have no confidence at all that that's going to work, really.
I won't ask you, Secretary Perry, to comment on sort of the contemporary situation unless you'd like to. But let me ask a question this way. So it was at least reported that one of your predecessors in the Nixon administration, when President Nixon was being particularly volatile, told the National Military Command Center, if it's ever the middle of the night and you get a phone call saying, let's do this and launch, check with me, even though that's not actually the protocol to be followed, is that if you had been in the Nixon administration as Secretary of Defense, is that the kind of thing you would have thought you had either A, the authority to do, or B, if you didn't have the authority to do, still a pretty damn good idea?
I can't imagine my being in that situation, first of all. But to try to answer your question, I would have seen that I had no legal way of stopping the president from doing that. And therefore, I would have sought illegal ways.
You would have sought illegal ways.
I would have sought illegal ways. I do not know whether the story is accurate. I have tried to confirm it. I have, by the most direct way, by asking Jim Schlesinger, did you in fact do that? And he was coy.
Yeah.
He was coy. I think he did. I think he did, but I can't prove it.
I
would have done the same thing.
For those quoting, I just wonder if you wanted to say extra legal.
Extra. Extra. Right.
Okay, we should move on with the question. Yes, sir, over here.
I'm Bruce McDonald at Johns Hopkins SAIS and former senior staff to the Strategic Posture Review Commission, supporting Mr. Perry and Dr. Perry and Dr. Schlesinger a few years back. My question,
That's when I asked him, by the way. You're doing that here. Panel, yeah.
That there's a whole separate question, yes, about that. I wanted to ask, I appreciated the work that CNAS has done and your comments, Secretary Perry, about technology and the future of strategic stability going forward, where it seems like the technology seems to be favoring in some ways detection, much more a greater capability than before. You usefully pointed out that you're concerned about the cyber and drones. I wondered if you could lift the horizon just a little bit and say, is there any other technology that causes you significant heartburn in terms of the future of strategic stability?
Well, a technical issue which I think is largely misunderstood is the question of missile defense. Can we make our technology of missile defense better so we have a higher probability of success? And my answer to that is probably not. We can make our ballistic missile defense systems better, but will they end up with a high probability of stopping a large-scale attack? And I cannot conceive of any technology for the defense which is going to stand up to the kind of technology which the offense can use, basically oriented around what we call decoys. If I were back in my days as an engineer and had to choose between designing penetration aids for ICBMs or designing defense systems, well, I would pick the penetration aids every day. There's a fundamental advantage to the offense, not just the advantage of timing, which is important, but the only way I know today and can conceive of making a defense system work against a ballistic missile attack is in the terminal phase of the where you're down to defending a city. You can conceive then, because by that time most decoys you can conceive of have been stripped off and you're down now just dealing with the warheads. Of course, you have a very little time to act by that then. And there are lots of other reasons why that's a hard problem. But that's at least an achievable problem, and you can imagine just build lots of defense systems to try to deal with that problem. But now you're down to defending individual cities, so defending 10, 20 cities in the United States becomes a huge undertaking to try to do that. So that's one area where technology, I think, is misunderstood because of the fundamental advantage which the defense. And the technologies which work to make the offense even better are easier to do and cheaper to do than the technologies that can make the defense better.
Celeste, this doesn't seem to stop the Russians from complaining about, or having complained in the past about missile defense in Europe, even though we make precisely these kinds of assurances to the
Ad
Russians.
nauseam.
That their focus on Iran has nothing to do with, it trying to deter Russia's ability to, launch its ICBMs and so forth. I haven't seen recently, but one can easily imagine the Russians saying something similar as we build up our missile defenses with respect to North Korea. What are the Russians worried about? And is it a talking point, or is it a genuine worry that they have about that we will, increase the capabilities of these things over time, and once we've got the installations, we have a foothold and so forth? I mean, what is really at issue here?
Well, Jim lived this too, so I'll leave some time for him to address it. But I think that the way to understand it is it's not just the missile defenses. It's a toolkit that they see us developing that you build into an operation to deny them the ability to not retaliate per se, but not to have an effective retaliation that is of sufficient impact in the Russian calculation to have a deterrent effect on the United States. So it's that if we are going in somewhere in Eurasia with overwhelming conventional force, standoff capabilities, we don't have to knock down every ICBM. We just need to knock down, the thinking of scenarios in which you're in a war-fighting scenario, not in an assured retaliation scenario. And that's where the danger lies for them, and therefore that's where the danger lies for us, because that's the source of the instability in a crisis or in a military situation where they start convincing themselves that they are now in one of the scenarios that they're playing out. And I know this is hard for Americans, because Americans sit there and think, but we wouldn't do that. We don't have enough confidence that we could shoot down enough missiles. You gotta, you tell my staff, Jeff's here, you have to turn on your Russian brain and think of this the way Russian security analysts are thinking of that to understand how they're playing these things out. Jim knows this too.
I would just add one point, and that is that notwithstanding the arguments we make and the graphics we may show, Russian paranoia on this issue, missile defense and the broader set that Celeste mentioned, is clearly real. If you look at the so-called Status 6 system that was displayed, quote unquote, leaked on Russia TV, this is a nuclear-powered torpedo with a multi-megaton weapon that's cobalt-laced is intended to take out roughly the west coast of the United States. If it's, and we've heard from, since I've been out of government, I've heard from some Russians out of government also that it's real. I've heard others speculate it's not. But whether it's real or it's not, the fact that it's clearly an effort by the Russians to make us believe it may be real, to me is an indicator that they are actually deeply concerned about the midterm, perhaps not today, but the midterm to long-term viability of their nuclear deterrent.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. We'll do two more questions. We'll do them together, and then the panel can choose which they want to.
So back to the recommendation of dialogue between the United States and Russia. So the National Defense Authorization Bill for FY18, in the Statement of Measures, in response to your recommendation, takes a stab at that, encouraging mill-to-mill dialogue and asking for a plan. So I think that's maybe a first step, and we'll have to see how the Defense Department responds. And then a second comment on your recommendation for how to respond to the INF Russia violation. We did take a stab at a bipartisan response. So it's two-pronged. One is developing a conventional GLICM. So it was the compromise, what it was that it would be conventional versus dual use. It's just, it's looking at R&D funding, right? So it wouldn't mandate testing or deployment. I think there's issues with where do you deploy this? Is it worth pursuing? But what I want to particularly emphasize was the second piece, which was mandating sanctions specifically tied to arms control violations and INF. So I hope we can build on that. But to my question, as we look at the nuclear posture review and discussions and what might be considered, there's increasing talk that they might consider low-yield ballistic missile options and SLCMs, the sea-launched cruise missiles. And so I'd be interested in your views on those options and recommendations for the nuclear posture review, if you have any. Thank you.
Okay, and then this gentleman right back here will bring us home, so to speak.
Hi, Bob Hale, former CFO at DOD. So you said, Dr. Perry, and the Air Force Comptroller, when you were Secretary, Dr. Perry, you said missile defense not viable for Russia. I understand that. We've heard Saturday that we're every day closer to war with North Korea from our National Security Advisor. How about missile defenses for small attacks, such as the one that could happen with North Korea? Is that a viable option for North Korea and maybe others?
Okay, so we've got, can we reduce miscalculations? The NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review, low-yield ballistic missile options, SLCMs, and this last question on North Korea and missile defense. So Celeste, why don't we start with you, and we'll sort of work our way down here.
So on reinforcing capabilities in Europe, I think the danger is, again, I don't believe that Russia is intending to invade the Baltics out of the blue and occupy it and do that whole. But I do think there is a danger of miscalculation where you have, say, instability in Belarus, which is extremely important for Russian defense capabilities. Russia and Belarus have integrated air defenses and basically integrated air force over that space. And you could find yourself in a misunderstanding where then the incentive on the Russian side is to go in fast and it, sort of on the conventional level, do the fait accompli. And so NATO having credible forces and capability to dissuade the Russian general staff from believing it could get away with a fast move is, I think, stabilizing. The trick is how much of that is stabilizing and how much looks like you're getting ready to invade Belarus. And I'll leave that to smarter people than I am in this room to think about that. But that's the sweet spot that NATO's talking about. I know they're trying to figure this out. I'm constantly reminding people, military-to-military cooperation, which is not on the table, it's not going to be productive, it's prohibited by Congress, does not preclude communication, military communication. And in fact, the Obama administration continued that in Syria and throughout at the appropriate level. And having the communication separated from the cooperation, that's great to hear you all are thinking of something like that. And my last little point on INF violation, so again, what would be effective in getting the Russian attention? They're obviously trying to gain a capability and an advantage through deploying a non-INF compliant cruise missile, either conventionally or nuclear armed, either one, both. So I think what the counter effort should be is at denying them the advantage of that deployment through defenses, through some kind of operational changes. In other words, it's like you think you just spent all that money, you just shredded your credibility a little bit, created problems in Europe, maybe got the Chinese to wonder what you're up to, and it's not even going to work because we can counter that capability, probably not symmetrically. That's not the most sensible way to counter that capability, even if you could get NATO allies to allow a deployment of weapons in Europe, which I doubt. But I think that I would, again, turn on the Russian part of the brain and think about what would deny them the advantage of that particular capability.
Secretary Perry.
Let me comment on the North Korean question.
Yes, please.
Start off by saying I think the ballistic missile defense systems we now have deployed in Korea cannot defend Seoul against any plausible North Korean attack. And that's assuming the systems work exactly as designed and advertised. The problem is they are, of course, subject to saturation. North Koreans have two tactics for saturating. Just firing lots of missiles at Seoul, one or two of which might be the one with a nuclear weapon. They've got lots of missiles that can reach Seoul. They don't have to have nuclear weapons on to saturate. Secondly, using decoys. Don't tell me the North Koreans aren't smart enough to make decoys. If they can make thermonuclear weapons, they can certainly make decoys. And so we have the problem that any ballistic missile defense system that's operating against a free flight missile is it's subject to decoys. And there's one bit of potential good news here, is that because of the unique geography of Korea, we have the potential of, if we elect to do it, of putting a ballistic missile defense system that operates against the missiles in powered flight. They have to be airborne, of course. So you can put in a drone, either a air-to-air missile that goes against the North Korean missile during the powered flight, or even a directed energy system. Ordinarily, that wouldn't work. But because of the geography of Korea, you could, in a drone patrol in international waters, you can see the missile being fired at Seoul during its powered flight. Certainly you can see one directed against the United States. A long time doing its powered flight. So that's an option I think we ought to be considering. I don't know that we are or not. But conventional ballistic missile defense systems can be saturated, and I think the North Koreans are entirely capable of doing that.
Jim.
I won't add anything to Celeste's great answer. I will try to add one thing on missile defense and give Secretary Perry the last word after I finish the thought. And that is that the ground-based mid-course defense system, now 44 interceptors, the Trump administration has moved forward to put 20 additional interceptors in for that. I think it's made enough progress that it has a reasonable prospect to successfully engage current generation or the emerging generation of North Korean ICBM. I don't know how long that will last, but I think that sustaining that investment and improving our system is fundamentally important, and it is in part a deterrent and part an assurance as well to obviously to our South Korean and Japanese allies.
Just to be clear, Jim, I was talking about an attack against
yes.
Korea or Japan, not attack against the United States, which is a different issue.
Yes, okay. And I agree with Secretary Perry's point on saturation and that looking toward an unmanned system. It could be a light interceptor. It could be directed energy as solid state is coming up. I think worth looking hard at. I'll venture into the slickums. You know, I think that I've written a piece with Sandy Winnefeld, Admiral Winnefeld, saying that go to a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile to reinforce extended deterrence and as a hedge against ASW, just based on numbers. I think at least to have a hedge program that's prepared to do that makes sense. And on the reduction in yield, I may be an outlier, but I believe that we have been correct to go down in yield over the years, and that if both for the morality of our deterrence posture and any employment should ever have to occur, and for the credibility of that to go to lower yield systems that meet the just war criteria of law, or law of armed conflict criteria of proportionality and discrimination, I think is the right thing to do. And it should be done in parallel with the steps that Secretary Perry has talked about stepping back and moving toward, as the Obama administration took some initial steps, moving toward a no first use or so-called sole purpose posture, as well as to a write-out posture. Both of those I think are important milestones that we should be aiming for, and not in 50 years down the road, but in the relative near term.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to Celeste, to Secretary Perry, to Jim for being here tonight. We are going to continue at CNAS and this report that we're doing with the Belfer Center to do work in this area. So stay tuned for continued conversation on those items. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us tonight. Thank you very much.